Meine Damen und Herren, ich freue mich sehr, Professor Wilhelm Gruissem vorstellen zu dürfen als nächster Redner. Herr Gruissem ist Professor für Biotechnologie, Pflanzenbiotechnologie an der ETH in Zürich und er war früher Direktor in einem Novartis-Programm an der Universität of California in Berkeley. Somit hat er einen Einblick in ganz verschiedene Welten und das wird seinen Vortrag sicher sehr spannend machen. Herr Gruissem, bitte, ich freue mich auf Ihren Vortrag.
Good afternoon, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here and spend some time with you this afternoon. The title of my presentation is Agricultural Plant Breeding. I gave it a second title, Can We Still Feed the World in 2050? Most of us will probably not be able to see the answer to that question. But I'm obviously quite optimistic that human ingenuity will figure out ways how we can feed ourselves in 40 years from now and hopefully much longer in the future. But on the way, we have a number of challenges, and we do have to address these challenges, and this is what I would like to do this afternoon. First of all, explain some of the challenges, but then also hopefully give you some insights into possible solutions. And in the second half, towards the end of my talk, I will also give you, I will use some work from our own lab to illustrate what I think can be done in order to solve some of the problems that we are facing. I mean, the first problem, of course, is population growth. And as you can see on this slide, I mean, I've projected population growth out to 2030. I mean, I don't know what the population will be like in 2050, whether it's going to be 9 billion or 9.5 billion or 8.7. I think most of us will have problems to predict where exactly that number will be. But the fact is that irrespective of what that number will be in the end, we know that most of the population growth will be in Asian countries and also in Africa. And that, of course, has consequences because no matter what we do, the people who will contribute to this population growth, they're already here. Okay, so I'm not talking about scenarios that we can stop. Although, of course, we could stop them, but that would be very difficult, I think. But if you see here the population charts for, sort of Japan and Switzerland, so this is not where the problem is. The problem is here, where we have a population that is very young and that will contribute to the population growth. Now, that represents quite a number of challenges because we will have to produce more food to feed these people. I mean, we hear arguments all the time, we're already producing enough food. It's all a distribution problem. I've heard these arguments many, many times. The food that we throw away here, we're not going to ship that to the Philippines or Indonesia to feed people there. That's not the solution. The solution is that wherever we have population growth, these nations must be able to also feed themselves. Not only that, but whatever we will have to produce in terms of food, I mean, that will have to be done on less area that is available. So if we look at the land mass on our planet, there just isn't that much more land available that we could bring into production in order to meet the demands for food. So I've just given here on this slide, I mean, the 5 biggest crops that we currently grow in the world, and you see that even projecting forward for only 20 years or so, in each one of these crops you have a significant increase that we have to accomplish in terms of production and yield. Now, if we look at the global cereal production, and I mean, you can go into the media, of course, the production has increased steadily for many decades now, and it is still increasing. But the trend that we are seeing is also that the actual annual improvement, that is, how much we can actually harvest on a per acreage basis, that this is now starting to be either flat or actually declining for several of the crops, and I will show you that in a couple of slides in more detail. So what then has actually contributed to this enormous production increase? Well, in part it had to do, of course, with the Green Revolution that most of you have already heard about, which was really driven by a single individual. That's the breeder and Nobel laureate Norman Borlaug, mostly in the 60s. And that was the development and breeding of new crop varieties. Here you have the example of high-yielding wheat variety, and you see that compared to these old varieties, they are much shorter, have higher yield, and therefore have been overall much more productive. But the side effect also was that it did require a lot of fertilizer input and also the increased use of pesticides, and that's what we are facing today. So our high-yielding agriculture is very much dependent on fertilizer and pesticides. But coming back to the issue that I mentioned before, and that is the yield increase that we have enjoyed for many decades now, for several crops that is coming to an end. So if you look at this graph here, and I've highlighted the three biggest crops, so there's maize, rice, and wheat, that provide 65% of the calories on this planet. 65%. So these three crops are responsible for 65% of the calories on this planet. You see that in the early 20th centuries, the yield per acreage was basically flat. I mean, it was a slight increase, and then we had that period that we generally call the Green Revolution, where we saw significant yield increases. And then, if we look at the rates now, for only one crop, that is for corn, for maize, the yield increase is still going up. So the breeders are very, very effective with breeding new corn varieties with increased yield, but that effectiveness has really slowed down for important crops like wheat and rice. Well, the consequence of that is, if we look at the grain production on a per capita basis, so that's the world cereal production on a per capita basis, you see that this, for the last 10, 15 years, has really been flat or even is declining. And we are at the moment, we are at about 2,000 kilocalories per head, per capita, that we are producing in terms of cereal grains. Now, if we want to keep that 2,000 calories into the future, then the curve really would have to look like this. Okay? It would have to go up if we just look at the next 10 years. So, yeah? That's how the curve would have to go. But right now it is really going like this. So there is a gap opening between, on a per capita basis, what we are actually producing, the yield that we are getting out of our crops versus what is needed going forward. So the consequences of that is that we need more production. We need to do that with less water, because water is an issue. I don't have time to talk about that. We need to do that with less fertilizer. There are issues with fertilizer as well, especially phosphates, depending on who you talk to. The reserves, the resources of phosphate, perhaps 200, maybe 300 years. It's similar to oil. What if the phosphate runs out? So we have to start to think about how to reclaim the phosphate in agriculture. We don't have much more land available. We should be using much fewer chemicals. I mean, if you think about, the amount of chemicals, I don't show you a slide here, that is just put into agriculture in Switzerland, where everybody is interested in eating organic food. It's enormous, okay? And I will not discuss the issue of climate change at all today because it simply isn't enough time. But of course, there are significant concerns in the scientific community that our crops have to be better adapted to more extreme weather scenarios. So what that means is we need more efficient breeding methods, we need better varieties, and of course we need a better and sustainable agriculture. And I think that is a very big task, and we don't have really that much time available to accomplish these challenges, to find solutions to these challenges. And then, of course, there is the issue that we are all aware of, but it's very difficult to really do something about that, and that is the hunger in the world. Currently, the numbers fluctuate a little bit, but we are about at 1 billion people who do not have enough to eat. There's probably even a larger number of people that are malnutrition. They may have enough calories, but they don't get the appropriate balanced diet. So in the last century, which is about 12 years ago, the big nations came together and said, by 2015 we want to have half the number of people that are hungry in the world, so to less than 500 million, and that's where we are now. Okay, so the number has not gone down; the number is going up, or it's relatively stable. So that's one issue. The other issue, of course, is self-sufficiency. Even in a country like Switzerland, we are globally connected. Switzerland is not self-sufficient. So if you look at the statistics from the Swiss Farmers Association, you see what we actually need in Switzerland. I mean, it's very difficult actually to get these numbers, but you see what we are producing. Very little export actually from Switzerland. It's mostly cheese and Bündnerfleisch. You all know that. Chocolate, but that's not really a food. Some consider it a food. I consider it food, but and then of course what we import in Switzerland. Okay? So Switzerland is not self-sufficient. It's almost 45% is imported. And what is this? It's mostly actual crops, mostly crops for animal feed. So if you think that all the cows in Switzerland are up on the Alps, I mean, you all know that. That's not true. They're actually getting food that is being grown in Brazil and in Argentina as well. So these are issues that I'm personally very concerned about because, I mean, right now it's fine. Switzerland, of course, is rich. I mean, we can afford to buy food somewhere else. But who will tell us that in 5 years from now, Brazil is still selling soybean, for example, to Switzerland rather than China or India? Okay? So we have to think about these issues and also address them here in Switzerland. And I think that is a biggest concern that I have. That these issues are really not being tackled here in this country and in Europe in general. I mean, what is true for Switzerland is true for almost every other country in Europe. So we have a number of issues. I mean, there's, of course, first of all, the issue of global food security, which I already pointed out will require enhanced productivity and also sustainable production, and of course there's a big concern that we all have. Water availability, I pointed this out already. And then there is the issue of bioenergy, and again, I will not address that at all here this afternoon. It would simply take too much time. And then the issue of climate change. But you see, we have a number of challenges, and I think we as a society have to address that. And I think it is also important that we as a generation, as the older generation, start to address these issues and not just leave it up to the younger generations to deal with the problems that, in part we are responsible for. So the issue then is really to set the priorities right. He may not be there in a few weeks from now, but nevertheless, I mean, he pointed out last year or 2 years ago that science is more essential for our prosperity, our health and environment, and our quality of life than it's ever been before. And I clearly support that. We put a lot of money into human health. If you look at the amount of money that we put into agricultural research, it's a minute amount, and that's actually where human health starts. There was an interesting report in the magazine Nature a couple of years ago on if you make investments in generally public research or public work and ask for where do you really get the highest return. I mean, I didn't realize that, but I was amazed that in many years the highest return you actually get when you make investments into agricultural research. And you see that pharmaceutical research shows up once, but it's not really the driving force. So what is it that we need to do? I mean, I call this the fast lane forward. I mean, we need to double our food supply. I mean, I think there's, from my perspective, there's no way around that. Of course, we have to reduce the ecological footprint of agriculture, reduce pollution, decrease the need for fresh water, and adapt our crops. And again, I mean, these are all issues we could discuss all afternoon, but I just want to pick out a few things and say, can we really do this faster? And what is it that we need to do to improve our crops so that we can generate the yield that we need 20, 30, 40 years from now? Well, you all know that our crop plants today are the result of breeding with gene mutations. So here is a very striking example. This is our modern-day corn, and this is actually the wild corn as it existed, or it still exists, that we started with about 10,000 years ago, and that's where we are now. And of course, I mean, all of that has been the result of mutations. I mean, when we look at our crops today, and I mean, all of you know this, but this is again something that we have to make the public aware of, that we have changed the genomes of our plants and animals, for that matter, for thousands of years. Since we started agriculture, actually, we have significantly impacted the genomes. To the point, and if you look into the more recent literature in the last 2 years now, that many of our modern varieties that we are growing now, that are now in the fields, have actually lost genes. So the breeders over thousands of years have lost genes in the crops that we are growing today. So if you go back to old varieties, or even some of the wild varieties, you find genes in there that are not present anymore in our modern day crops. Okay, so therefore I think it is actually very important also. And again, this is an issue. I could, if you would give me a lot of time, I would be happy to talk about it, to actually capture the information that we have in crops that we are not using anymore, varieties that we are not using anymore. So the crop plants that we have are not natural, and neither our pets. I mean, you all know that, okay? And I think that is important also that we make the public aware of that, because then they also start to understand what perhaps biotechnology can do to improve our crops, and I will show you some examples. What we do today with modern-day breeding, I mean, we're using new methods like, for example, marker-assisted selection. In part, I mean, that is facilitated by the fact that the genome sequences are available, so the breeders can actually target specific traits. We now know the underlying genes, and that has, compared to, even 20, 25 years ago, when the breeder went through the field and said, "Oh yeah, you are good, I keep you, and you're bad," and that was sort of the breeding approach that we have done. Today, it's done much faster. Okay, so the breeding cycles are actually they're still long in comparative terms, but we now have molecular methods available to really facilitate the breeding. Even to the point that we can now use genome-wide methods, so-called genome-wide association studies, to identify genes and traits that we are interested in and use them actually in the breeding. And then what we are doing with gene technology is in fact a logical continuation of these precise or high precision breeding methods, and that is that rather than breeding the crops, taking two parents and make the cross, if we have specific traits that we are interested in and we know the underlying molecular biology, we can actually utilize that in order to then take this particular trait and put it directly into the elite varieties that we are interested in. And not only that, I mentioned just a few minutes ago that we have actually lost genes. And there was a good example just published in Nature a few weeks ago that a group in the Philippines actually found a gene for phosphate uptake in old varieties. They put that into our elite varieties that are growing in the field right now and could show that the yield goes actually up 10-15%. Just by taking that one gene out of the old variety, put that into the elite variety works. So, we can learn a lot from model plants, and I just realized that I lost my model plant here on that slide. I don't know what happened to it, but there should be the Arabidopsis model plant here in the middle. And of course, there's a lot of research being done with this model plant. So there are many aspects that we can investigate using this model plant, just like in human health. We're using mouse or we're using rats or pigs as model systems to look at underlying molecular mechanisms to understand the traits and the aspects that we would like to facilitate in breeding. So you could do this in model systems. I don't see any reason why all of that has to be done in a crop system. And because we have pipelines, we have methods available now how the information from these model systems can be very quickly introgressed into our crop plant. So if you have either specific traits where you have learned about the molecular biology, you look for this particular trait in the crop plants, or you can actually do this by gene technology if you have identified genes that you are interested in. So I could spend a long time now giving you examples, but here is just one example. I think that was actually done by a company in the US, not Monsanto. I think it was Dow. They introduced a mutated rice gene that suppressed the branching of shoots. So they made the plants actually more, they prevented these formation of these tillers, which use up a lot of energy but don't necessarily produce to yields in term of grains. And they could show that just by this introducing a single gene into the elite rice varieties, you can improve the yield significantly. Okay? So if you talk to breeders about what is it that we can do, then they will tell you that the germplasm that we currently have available. There's probably only a limited amount that we can still get out of the germplasm. Okay? In terms of conventional breeding. But there is certainly improvement in agricultural techniques. So how do you actually grow the crops? There's a significant increase or potential in new breeding methods to breed crops faster. And then, of course, this area here, this is projection. This is where biotechnology could make a significant impact in improving our crops. Now, if you look at what is grown already, biotech crops are major drivers currently in production increases. You have the biotechs. When I talk biotech crops, I mean actually BT cotton, BT rice, and BT corn, and soybean, and so on and so on. They are now grown in more than 27 countries. I think that number is right, and by more than 16 million farmers around the world. And interestingly, the there are now, this year for the first time, more farmers in developing countries using this technology than we have in the developed countries. And but again, I mean, I'm also a little bit critical of this type of development because, I mean, even though I consider this the first generation gene technology crops, I think we can do much better. What we have out there in terms of traits, and that is of course part of the debate that we currently have, especially in Europe, is mostly helping the farmers. Okay, it's not helping the consumer, but I mean there are many traits in the pipeline where I think there could be a significant consumer benefit. So, but even for these crops, I mean, I think it is important that the public has to understand that if these crops would have not been available, for example, in 2008, we would have to grow much more of these crops on more land. So these modern crops have, in fact, increased the efficiency, and you can go crop after crop and see, what the actual increase in productivity has been with the new technology. What is also often misrepresented in the public is that there is a environmental benefit. Like, for example, if you grow BT corn in your field, I mean, you reduce the amount of insecticide that you have to put into this field because the crop is already protected. And so accordingly, I mean, the input of chemicals in the fields has gone down. I mean, of course, there is an increase in herbicides because the herbicide-tolerant crops are using. I mean, more farmers are using this, and of course, that then generates also more input. But overall, I think that this is the right approach. This is the right direction that we have to go to make our crops less dependent on chemicals that we put into the fields. But as a consequence of this debate, yes, we do have these crops available, but we have also created the society, the politicians, we have created a regulatory system that makes it very difficult that traits that are being developed in public research can ever get into the market. Okay? So I will show you in the next few slides some of the work that we are doing where we actually have crops available that we can bring into the market now. Okay? But will the ETH make 10, 20, 30 million available so that I can go through deregulatory processes, make sure that these crops can then actually be handed over to the farmers? The answer is simply no. Okay? So I would have to go to one of the big companies to help me, and I will show you the crops we are working on. The companies are not interested in. So novel traits that are in the public domain, and again, that is an issue we have to address as a society, will have very little chance to help the issue of food security. So I'll give you two examples of the type of work we are doing here at the ETH. In terms of both addressing the issue of food security, but also nutritional quality of our crops. We are working on rice and cassava. I mean, I made that decision when I came to ETH 12 years ago. These are crops that are not important for the Swiss or for the Europeans, but these are crops that are eaten by about 4 billion people in the world. About 3 billion people in the world who eat rice. There's another billion that eat cassava, and it's mostly in Asia, and in Africa. One issue that we are addressing, especially with cassava or manioc, some of you may know that crop under this name, is viruses. I mean, you heard already this morning from Antonio Lanciaveca how animals protect themselves using antibodies against viruses. We need to use a slightly different technology in croplands to find solutions. One of the big problems in cassava is that there are currently two viruses that are really rampaging through Africa and that are attacking the crops. I mean, cassava originates from South America and from the Amazon region, was introduced into Africa a few hundred years ago, And of course, there are viruses in Africa that have very quickly adopted cassava as their host. These viruses don't exist in South America. So one virus that we are concerned about is the cassava mosaic virus. It's a DNA virus that is basically all over sub-Saharan Africa. And it's transmitted by the whitefly, which is another serious issue because the whitefly the population has also increased significantly in the last 10, 15 years. So 15 years ago, if you would look at a cassava plant, there would be a few whiteflies on here. Now there are really, sometimes the leaves are white. So when the plant is infected, that's how it looks like. Okay? This is a healthy cassava plant. This is a plant that is really seriously infected by the mosaic virus. And you can imagine that this plant will not produce anything. It's lost for the farmer and the consumer. This is what you would like to have. The consequence is that just the cassava mosaic virus alone results in the infections result in a drop of about 25% of potential production yield in Africa. So that's an enormous amount of food that gets lost to these viruses. Okay? So there are now varieties available that have resistance, where farmers have resistance, but we also know that the resistance is broken down by the virus fairly quickly. And so we need to develop strategies actually to develop durable resistance in this crop. Another virus that is a threat to Africa, it's currently confined to Eastern Africa, is an RNA virus. It's the cassava brown streak virus. And this virus, the plants don't look at as bad. Sometimes you don't even see symptoms on the plant. But then if you go into the root, the virus also affects the roots. It makes these brown lesions in the root. And of course, that's lost to the farmer as well because the consumer will not eat that. And there's now big concern because that virus is spreading also throughout Western Africa. Now, these viruses, similar to actually probably what they do in humans as well. There will be some interesting research coming out from Olivier Voynet's lab on that issue, and I will not say anything about that, but it's very exciting. The viruses, when they infect the host, especially in plants, they often target the host machinery for producing small RNAs that often helps the host, the plant, to protect itself against viruses. Okay, so the virus, when it infects the plants, tries to suppress this host RNA, small RNA machinery, in order to multiply and then spread throughout the plant. And you see this here on this slide, these small RNA transcripts that are actually produced by the plants during a viral infection. So we thought about that process and thought, well, why don't we already produce these RNAs when the virus isn't there? So in other words, we are now actually taking bits and pieces of the virus itself and implanting that into the cassava genome so that the cassava plant actually produces these small RNAs constitutively before the virus even infects. Okay? So when the virus comes in there, these RNAs are already there. They can align with the virus genome or the RNAs that are actually produced by the viral genome and then help the host to degrade these RNAs. So, we know how to work with this technology now. We have actually produced a number of transgenic plants now. You see here in this slide, that we can in fact create immunity in these plants with this technology, and we have several successful events where, when you now infect the plants with the virus at very high levels, they're completely immune. Okay? We have tested these plants already for their agronomic traits in Puerto Rico, and we are now negotiating with several countries in Africa actually to test these plants in Africa as well. But as I pointed out before, there are two viruses in Africa. There's this mosaic virus, and then there's the brown streak virus. How can we actually generate cassava varieties now that are immune against both of the viruses. And there we decided, rather than sort of creating a double transgenic strategy, let's try an approach where we take actually varieties that are already grown by the farmer, that are preferred by the consumers, that have resistance to one of the viruses, put on top of that resistance to the other virus. And that's an approach that we tried and successfully. The work was published actually a few weeks ago and generated quite a bit of media attention. So we have varieties now that are immune to both viruses. And again, we are negotiating with the Gates Foundation and colleagues in Africa now to deploy this material in Africa, and hopefully, I think this would be a very, very fast way to product development actually, that then will be of enormous benefit to the farmers and to the consumers as well. But that's not our only strategy. We are also thinking about, of course, how can you make that technology available to countries where it's needed? I don't see our role in ETH, to continuously do product development and come up with good strategies and then ship it to Africa or ship it to Asia. I think our role should be here to develop the technology, make sure that the technology works, that it's robust, and then bring that technology actually to the countries where people need it, where the scientists can implement that technology to help their own agriculture. And that's what we are now doing actually quite successfully. We are working with colleagues in Kenya at the Biosciences of Eastern and Central Africa, in Tanzania and also in South Africa. And Tanzania is still a little bit shaky. It has to do with the infrastructure there, but the technology platform that we have developed here at ETH is now already fully implemented in South Africa and in Kenya. In fact, in South Africa, our colleagues there, they're already working with a brewing company that makes beer from cassava, which actually tastes very, very good. They want to have virus-resistant plants for their production. So that's one example where I think that our science here, the technologies that we are developing, can actually make a contribution to food security. Okay? Another example that I quickly wanted to point out is the issue of malnutrition. So it's not only that we need to produce enough food, we also have to make sure that the food that we produce is nutritious enough so that people are healthy. Okay? That's a big issue. So if you look at, for example, in the world where we have malnutrition and where we grow rice, rice is between these two red lines here, you see that malnutrition is coincident to a large extent with regions where we grow rice. And the reason for that is that rice, many people in the world, that's a major staple, so they eat 1 or 2 meals a day of rice, perhaps a little else, but it's mostly rice. Rice gives you enough calories so you feel you're not hungry, but you're still malnutrition because you're not getting all the micronutrients that you need, because rice is very poor in micronutrient. And that then has consequences. So if you look at the numbers here, and that's something that we often forget. We think about hunger, but this is what we call the hidden hunger. There are many children, for example, that die every year because they don't get enough vitamin A. But more serious, or even more serious, there are billions of people in the world who are malnourished, and therefore they are not really contributing members to our society. So they're sick, they're not at their peak capacity, and therefore cannot really contribute at the level that would be necessary. Vitamin A, again, that's a product of ETH in rice. That's the golden rice that you have probably heard about, was developed by my predecessor, Ingo Potricus. They featured him on Time magazine about 10 years ago. The rice is still not in the market. I find that a serious problem. So here you have this golden rice now that is actually enriched in carotene, beta-carotene, and beta-carotene is a precursor for vitamin A. And vitamin A is, of course, very important for us. I mean, it's important for our eyesight, for example. That rice could save the lives of millions of children. And it's still, if you think about it, I mean, he developed that rice in 2000. The paper was published in Science in 2000, and now we have 2012. And hopefully next year, they're hoping that it's going to be released in Indonesia and Bangladesh and probably also in Vietnam. That's one issue where I think that and again, I mean, we can discuss this later. Of course, there have been many programs to provide these micronutrients, and you go around and see what impact did they actually have. Most of these programs have failed. Why? Because nutrition, I mean, micronutrients must come with your food. I mean, it doesn't help you very much to eat these pills. I mean, especially when they cannot be distributed. So another example is iron. Iron is actually a very serious problem. So if you look here on this chart, where we have iron deficiency in the world, I mean, it's even in developed countries, I mean, like the US and Europe, Australia, but it's more serious, again, in regions of the world where people eat cassava or rice. Okay? And again, the problem is that these crops, which are the major staple for these people, don't have sufficient iron, and that has a number of consequences: mental development, fertility problem, immune system is depressed, and so on. So the reason is, as I pointed out already, that rice doesn't have enough micronutrients. Is actually rice is very good, but most of the micronutrients are actually stored in the husk. But what we eat is this polished rice. Okay? And the reason why we have to remove that husk is otherwise you can't store the rice. So it's sort of a vicious cycle, right? I mean, here we have something very nutritious that we feed to our animals, but we eat what is less nutritious. So again, we have thought about that and said, can we actually improve the iron content in the rice corn, I mean, in the rice endosperm that we eat? And we have taken a strategy where we said, okay, well, we need, first of all, a protein that we can put into the endosperm that can capture the iron molecules, can keep them and make them available when we eat them. So that molecule, I mean, that protein actually is ferritin. That is also, I mean, you have it in your liver. That's why your liver is red, because you have ferritin in there that binds about 3,000 to 4,000 molecules of iron. Okay? So we have used not the human ferritin, we use the ferritin protein from plants, we use the bean protein. There are reasons for that, I can explain that. But we put that into the endosperm, specifically expressed it there, and then we also thought about, but we also need to get the iron up there where we want to store it. And there we used a protein that is involved in iron transport, and we put that into the rice plant. And then we also put another enzyme in there, phytase, which makes the iron actually bioavailable. We actually now think that it's not necessary, and we have left it out in our new strategies. But the result of that, strategy that we use is that we have now rice lines that have about a 6.3-fold increase in iron in the endosperm. We published that 3 years ago now, 3 years ago. And so that's already physiologically significant. I mean, we're not quite there yet. We have to be up about 10 or 12-fold. That's then with one meal of rice, you get enough iron, the recommended daily allowance of iron. But what you see here from this strategy is also that the two genes that we put into the plant, they work synergistically to bring us up to this level that we have found in our plants. So the question is, can we improve on that? That's what we are currently trying to do. We have now extended this strategy actually to put also a protein in there, a transporter for iron uptake, to see if that iron uptake transporter is now working synergistically with the transport protein and storage protein to further increase the iron level in the plant. So the plants are in the greenhouse, currently being analyzed. You see they look beautiful. So this is how the rice grows in Switzerland. Looks beautiful. We are actually quite optimistic. I mean, we see not only that the plants look good, but they seem to have some improved growth properties. So we're looking into that right now. Again, this is an example where I think modern technology that we have available now can actually deliver something that is currently impossible with breeding. I mean, I forgot to mention this. All the traits we are working on is something that you cannot do by breeding. Okay? If you can do it by breeding, do it by breeding. But scientists, breeders have already tried in the past. I mean, there aren't rice varieties available that have enough iron content in the endosperm to accomplish this by breeding. So let me finish here by perhaps giving you a few thoughts on the way, what we can do to reach global food security, but also improve nutritional health. What I tried to impress on you this afternoon, hopefully, was that we do need new crop varieties with high and stable yield, but also with improved nutritional qualities, and, of course, all of that in a sustainable agricultural setting. I didn't have time to talk about the second aspect, and that is for crop improvement, we also need to better understand and exploit the diversity of our croplands that we are not using anymore. Okay? So that is, again, another important topic that's very close to my heart. I'm working on that, and that's going to be my retirement project. And, of course, we need innovative research. We need efficient breeding and new technologies, including gene technology. We should not forget that. I mean, gene technology is not going to be the answer to everything, but it's an important tool in our arsenal of breeding methods that we now have available. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening and hopefully supporting innovative agriculture, because I think we owe that to our future generations. Thank you.